Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender. Dahmer murdered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991, with the majority of the murders occurring between 1987 and 1991. His murders involved rape, dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism. On the 28th of November, 1994, he was beaten to death by an inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution where he had been incarcerated. Early life. Dahmer was born in West Allis, Wisconsin, the son of Joyce Annette Ney Flint and Lionel Herbert Dahmer, an analytical chemist. 7 years later, his brother David was born. Joyce Dahmer reportedly had a difficult pregnancy with her elder son. When Jeffrey was 8 years old, he moved with his family to Bath, Ohio. Dahmer grew increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative between the ages of 10 and 15, showing little interest in any hobbies or social interactions. He biked around his neighborhood looking for dead animals, which he dissected at home or in the woods near his home. In one instance, he put a dog's head on a stake. Though fundamentally an outcast at Revere High School, Dahmer nonetheless became something of a cult figure among some students due to his impressions of his mother's interior decorator, who suffered from cerebral palsy. Dahmer began drinking in his teens and was an alcoholic by the time of his high school graduation. In 1977, Lionel and Joyce Dahmer divorced. Dahmer attended the Ohio State University, but dropped out after one quarter, having failed to attend most of his classes. He was drunk for the majority of the term. Dahmer's father then forced him to enlist in the army. Dahmer did well at first, but he was discharged after 2 years because of his alcoholism. When the army discharged Dahmer in 1981, he was provided with a plane ticket to anywhere in the country. Dahmer later told police he could not go home to face his father, so he headed to Miami Beach, Florida, because he was tired of the cold. He spent most of his time there at a hospital, but was soon kicked out for drinking. After coming home, he continued to drink heavily, and he was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct later in 1981. In 1982, Dahmer moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, where he lived for 6 years. During this time, his behavior grew increasingly strange. His grandmother once found a fully dressed male mannequin in his closet. Dahmer had stolen it from a store. On another occasion, she found a .357 Magnum under his bed. Terrible smells came from the basement. Dahmer told his father that he had brought home a dead squirrel and dissolved it with chemicals. He was arrested twice for indecent exposure in 1982 and 1986. In his second offense, he masturbated in front of 2 boys. In summer 1988, Dahmer's grandmother asked him to move out because of his late nights, his strange behavior, and the foul smells from the basement. He then found an apartment on Milwaukee's west side, closer to his job at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. On the 26th of September, 1988, one day after moving into his apartment, he was arrested for drugging and sexually fondling a 13-year-old boy in Milwaukee. He was sentenced to 5 years probation and 1 year in a work release camp. He was required to register as a sex offender. Dahmer was paroled from the work release camp 2 months early, and he soon moved into a new apartment. Shortly thereafter, he began a string of murders that ended with his arrest in 1991. Murders. Dahmer committed his first murder in the summer of 1978, at the age of 18. His father was away on business and his mother had moved out, taking his brother with her. Dahmer was left behind alone. That June, Dahmer picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks and offered to drink beer with him back at his father's house, planning to eventually have sex with him. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks to death with a 10-pound dumbbell, striking the back of his head, later saying he had committed the crime because the guy wanted to leave and he didn't want him to. Dahmer buried the body in the backyard. 9 years passed before he killed again. In September 1987, Dahmer picked up 26-year-old Stephen Tuomi at a bar and killed him on impulse. He later said he had no memory of committing the crime. After the Tuomi murder, Dahmer continued to kill sporadically. 2 more murders in 1988 and another in early 1989, usually picking up his victims in gay bars and having sex with them before killing them. He kept the skull of one of his victims, Anthony Sears, until he was caught. In May 1990, he moved out of his grandmother's house for the last time and into an apartment that later became infamous. Apartment 213, 924 North 25th Street, Milwaukee. Dahmer picked up the pace of his killing. 4 more murders before the end of 1990, 2 more in February and April 1991, and another in May 1991. In the early morning hours of May 27, 1991, 14-year-old Konorak Sintasomphony, the younger brother of the boy whom Dahmer had molested in 1988, was discovered on the street, wandering naked, heavily under the influence of drugs and bleeding from his rectum. 2 young women from the neighborhood found the dazed boy and called 911. Dahmer chased his victim down and tried to take him away, but the women stopped him. Dahmer told John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish, police officers dispatched to the scene, that Sintasomphony was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that they had an argument while drinking. Against the protests of the 2 women who had called 911, who recognized him from the neighborhood and insisted that he was a child and couldn't speak English, the officers turned him over to Dahmer. They later reported smelling a strange scent while inside Dahmer's apartment, but did not investigate it. The smell was the body of Tony Hughes, Dahmer's previous victim, decomposing in the bedroom. The officers did not make any attempt to verify Sintasomphony's age or identity, nor locate someone who could communicate with him, and failed to run a background check that would have revealed Dahmer being a convicted child molester still under probation. Later that night, Dahmer killed and dismembered Sintasomphone, keeping his skull as a souvenir. By summer 1991, Dahmer was murdering approximately 1 person each week. He killed Matt Turner on the 30th of June, Jeremiah Weinberger on the 5th of July, Oliver Lacey on the 12th of July, and finally Joseph Branderhoft on the 19th of July. Dahmer got the idea that he could turn his victims into zombies, completely submissive, eternally youthful sexual partners, and attempted to do so by drilling holes into their skulls and injecting hydrochloric acid or boiling water into the frontal lobe area of their brains with a large syringe, usually while the victim was still alive. Other residents of the Oxford Apartments complex noticed terrible smells coming from apartment 213, as well as the thumps of falling objects and the occasional buzzing of a power saw. Unlike many serial killers, Dahmer killed victims from a variety of racial backgrounds. Known victims: Stephen Hicks, 19. Location: Bath Township, June 1978. Method: he got him drunk, then hit with a dumbbell, and finally strangled. Disposal: after killing Stephen, he dismembered the body with a carving knife. He later pulverized the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered the bones around the property. The flesh was put into bags and buried in a crawl space under the house. It wasn't until 3 years later that police and forensics found the remains. Stephen Tuomi, 24. Location: Ambassador Hotel, the 21st of November, 1987. Method: got victim drunk, then smashed his chest in and attempted to rip out his heart. Disposal: in a panic, he rushed out to the nearest store and bought a large trunk where he placed the dismembered carcass. He then took the body back to his grandmother's house and put it in the basement where he could continue to cut it up. After doing so, he put the remains into a plastic bag and threw it out with the garbage. No remains were ever found of Stephen Tuomi. James Jamie Doxtater, 14. Location: Dahmer's grandmother's house, West Allis, south of Milwaukee. The 16th of January, 1988. Method: The victim was drugged, then strangled. His flesh was removed from the bones with acid and the bones were once again pulverized. Disposal, same as Stephen Hicks. Richard Guerrero, 23. Location: Dahmer's grandmother's house, the 24th of March, 1988. Method: after having oral sex with the victim, he gave Richard a drink laced with sleeping pills. He then strangled him. Disposal: Dahmer dismembered the corpse and disposed of the remains in the garbage. Anthony Lee Sears, 26. Location: grandmother's house, the 25th of March, 1989. Method: strangled him before dismembering the corpse. He cut off his head and genitals to keep as trophies. He then painted the skull ray. Disposal: as previous victim. Raymond Lamont Smith, 33. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, May 20, 1990. Method: strangled the victim, then engaged in oral sex with the cadaver. He then dismembered the body and removed the head. The skull was then painted gray and placed in his fridge. Disposal: the bones were left in a tank of acid until all the bones were defleshed. He then placed the bones around his apartment as ornaments. Edward W. Smith, 27. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 14th of June, 1990. Method: he was enticed into Dahmer's lair where he was drugged, strangled, then dismembered. Disposal: the remains were placed in the acid to dissolve. Ernest Miller, 22. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street. Method: Ernest Miller was lured into Dahmer's apartment by the temptation of earning $50 to pose nude for the camera. He was then drugged, then had his throat cut. Disposal: Dahmer removed the flesh with acid, bleached the skeleton, and kept it in his wardrobe. He also kept the victim's biceps and placed them in a freezer for later consumption. David Thomas, 23. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 24th of September, 1990. Method: Dahmer gave him a laced drink containing sleeping pills. Disposal: as previous. Curtis Straughter, 19. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 18th of February, 1991. Method: drugged, then strangled. Disposal: his cadaver was dismembered and the bones crushed. The skull was kept and the rest was dumped into the garbage. Errol Lindsay, 19. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 7th of April, 1991. Method: Errol was tempted into Dahmer's lair by being offered money to pose naked. He was then strangled. Disposal: Dahmer had oral sex with the corpse before dismembering it. He kept the skull as a trophy. Anthony Hughes, 31. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, May 24, 1991. Method: Tony was a deaf mute but was still tempted into Dahmer's apartment by written request, asking him to pose nude. Once inside, Dahmer drugged him and then strangled him. Disposal: after killing him, he left the body lying around the apartment for a couple of days before the process of dismemberment was engaged. The corpse was left dissolving in acid. His skull was kept. Conorak Synthosomphan, 14. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, May 27, 1991. Method: Conorak was drugged and experimented on before he was strangled. The experiments were to drill a hole into the back of the cranium and injecting hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobes of the brain while he was still alive. Such experiments were to create a zombie in order to be in complete control of his victim. Disposal: the body was dismembered and stored in the acid. Matt Turner, 20. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 30th of June 1991. Method: as with most other victims, he was lured into Dahmer's chambers where he was drugged and strangled. Disposal: the body was dismembered and left lying around his apartment. Jeremy Weinberger, 23. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 7th of July, 1991. Method: not much unlike Conorak, except he had boiling water injected into his head and left alive in a cauterized state for 2 days. He was later strangled. Disposal: the cadaver was dismembered and stored in acid. Oliver Lacey, 23. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 15th of July, 1991. Method: as with most of his victims, he was drugged and strangled. Disposal: during dismemberment, Dahmer would sodomize the corpse before being stored. His heart was kept in the fridge. Joseph Breedhoft, 25. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 19th of July, 1991. Method: Joseph was lured into the apartment by being offered money to pose nude. He was then drugged and then strangled. Disposal: the corpse was again dismembered, but not completely. The head and torso were kept in his apartment. Victims that got away: Kaizen Synthesomphone, 13. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street. Just 24 hours after moving into his new apartment at North 24th Street, Dahmer was in trouble with police. He had conned a Laudian boy, Kaizen Synthesomphone, 13, into coming up to his apartment. Once there, Dahmer drugged and molested him, but the boy escaped. He reported the incident to the police, and Dahmer was charged with sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. He spent 1 week in jail before getting released on bail. On the 30th of January, 1990, Dahmer was found guilty, but sentencing wouldn't take place for another 4 months. Tracy Edwards, 32. Location: 213 Oxford Apartments, North 25th Street, the 22nd of July, 1991. Tracy was tempted into 213 by Dahmer, where he was given a cocktail to make him drowsy. Dahmer then tried to make sexual advances towards him. Tracy started to struggle when Dahmer slipped some handcuffs onto his right arm. As Dahmer went for a knife, Tracy made a run for the unlocked door. Dahmer tried to haul him back inside when a brawl started, and Dahmer was hit hard on side of his head, knocking him to the floor. Tracy had escaped and ran into the street, where he flagged down a patrol car. The cops were then led into Dahmer's chamber of horrors. What the cops saw would linger in their minds for the rest of their lives. Photos of various states of dismemberment, a severed head lying on the floor. The fridge had 3 bags containing a heart, flesh, and a portion of muscle. A freezer contained 3 heads, a human torso, a bag containing flesh, and some internal organs. The cupboard contained various chemicals and 2 bleached skulls. On the floor there was a large kettle holding 2 hands, a penis, and testicles. There was 3 more skulls found in a filing cabinet. A wardrobe contained a complete skeleton, dried human scalp, and more genitals. In a box there was 2 more skulls. Next to the box there was a 260-liter vat containing acid. Police found 3 human torsos in various stages of decomposition. Arest. On the 22nd of July, 1991, Dahmer lured another man, Tracy Edwards, into his home. According to the would-be victim, Dahmer struggled with Edwards in order to handcuff him, but ultimately failed to cuff his wrists together. Wielding a large butcher knife, Dahmer forced Edwards into the bedroom, where Edwards saw pictures of mangled bodies on the wall and noticed the terrible smell coming from a large blue barrel. The barrel was filled with potent acid, which dissolved human bodies to sludge for disposal via the apartment toilet. Edwards punched Dahmer in the face, kicked him in the stomach, ran for the door, and escaped. Running through the streets with handcuffs still hanging from one hand, Edwards waved for help to a police car driven by Robert Ralph and Rolf Muller of the Milwaukee Police Department. Edwards led police back to Dahmer's apartment, where Dahmer at first acted friendly to the officers. However, Edwards remembered that the knife Dahmer had threatened him with was in the bedroom. When one of the officers checked the bedroom, he saw the photographs of mangled bodies and called for his partner to arrest Dahmer. As one officer subdued Dahmer, the other opened the refrigerator and found a human head. Further searching of the apartment revealed 3 more severed heads, multiple photographs of murdered victims and human remains, severed hands and penises, and photographs of dismembered victims and human remains in his refrigerator. The story of Dahmer's arrest and the inventory in his apartment quickly gained notoriety. Several corpses were stored in acid-filled vats, and implements for the construction of an altar of candles and human skulls were found in his closet. Accusations soon surfaced that Dahmer had practiced necrophilia and cannibalism. 7 skulls were found in the apartment. A human heart was found in the freezer. Trial. Dahmer was indicted on 17 murder charges, later reduced to 15. Dahmer was not charged in the attempted murder of Edwards. His trial began on the 30th of January 1992. With evidence overwhelmingly against him, Dahmer pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The court found Dahmer sane and guilty on 15 counts of murder and sentenced him to 15 life terms, totaling 957 years in prison, which was the maximum penalty available as Wisconsin abolished capital punishment in 1853. At his sentencing hearing, Dahmer expressed remorse for his actions and said that he wished for his own death. In May of that year, Dahmer was extradited to Ohio, where he entered a plea of guilty for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. Imprisonment and death. Dahmer served his time at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he ultimately declared himself a born-again Christian. Roy Ratcliffe, a local preacher from the Churches of Christ, met with Dahmer and agreed to baptize him. Dahmer was attacked twice in prison, the first time in July 1994. An inmate attempted to slash Dahmer's throat with a razor blade while Dahmer was returning to his cell from a church service in the prison chapel. Dahmer escaped the incident with superficial wounds. While doing janitorial work in the prison gym, Dahmer and another inmate, Jesse Anderson, were severely beaten by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver with a broomstick handle on the 28th of November, 1994. Dahmer died of severe head trauma while on his way to the hospital in an ambulance. Anderson died 2 days later from his wounds. Aftermath. Upon learning of his death, Dahmer's mother, Joyce Flint, responded angrily to the media. Now is everybody happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone? The response of the families of Dahmer's victims was mixed, although it appears most were pleased with his death. The district attorney who prosecuted Dahmer cautioned against turning Scarver into a folk hero, noting that Dahmer's death was still murder. The Oxford apartments at 924 North 25th Street were demolished in 1992. The site is now a vacant lot. Plans to convert the site into a memorial garden failed to materialize. In 1994, Lionel Dahmer published a book, A Father's Story, and donated a portion of the proceeds from his book to the victims' families. Most of the families showed support for Lionel Dahmer and his wife, Shari. He has retired from his career as an analytical chemist and resides with his wife in Medina County, Ohio. Lionel Dahmer is an advocate for creationism, and his wife was a member of the board of the Medina County, Ohio Horsemen's Council. Both continue to carry the name Dahmer and say they love Jeffrey despite his crimes. Jeffrey's mother and Lionel Dahmer's first wife, Joyce Flint, died of cancer in 2000. Jeffrey's younger brother, David, changed his last name, and lives in anonymity. Dahmer's estate was awarded to the families of 11 of his victims who had sued for damages. In 1996, Thomas Jacobson, a lawyer representing 8 of the families, announced a planned auction of Dahmer's estate to raise up to $1 million, sparking controversy. A civic group, Milwaukee Civic Pride, was quickly established in an effort to raise the funds to purchase and destroy Dahmer's possessions. The group pledged $407,225, including a $100,000 gift by Milwaukee real estate developer Joseph Zilber for purchase of Dahmer's estate. 5 of the 8 families represented by Jacobson agreed to the terms, and Dahmer's possessions were destroyed and buried in an undisclosed Illinois landfill. In January 2007, evidence surfaced potentially linking Dahmer to Adam Walsh's 1981 abduction and murder in Florida. However, Adam's father, John Walsh, believed that another serial killer, Otis Toole, committed the crime. When interviewed about Adam Walsh in the early 1990s, Dahmer repeatedly denied involvement in the crime. In 2008, Florida police declared the Walsh case closed, naming Toole, who died in prison in 1996, as the killer. Notes: Dahmer is remarkably similar to Soviet serial killer Andrei Chikatilo. Both were prolific, ephebophilic, hebephilic, and cannibalistic serial killers who had distant yet loving fathers and problematic mothers. Dahmer's father was often away with his studies, and his mother was a depressed hypochondriac. Chikatilo's father was captured during war, and his mother was abusive. They had a younger sibling, half in Chikatilo's case, were introverted yet academically achieving in school. They had failed college experiences. Dahmer dropped out, while Chikatilo failed to get in. They served in their country's army, were in at least one unsuccessful relationship, and had sexual problems which propelled them into killing. Dahmer was homosexual and had a need for dominance, while Chikatilo could only be aroused through violence. They committed their first murders in 1978, with the crime going unsolved for many years, and then becoming dormant afterwards until the 80s. They were arrested for minor offenses and released, with police being unaware that they were killers, and their crimes would carry on into the early 1990s. They primarily targeted male minors with both high and low-risk lifestyles, though they also killed older victims, and Chikatilo also killed females, lured them to their murder sites with ruses, killed with primarily one method, but utilized others too, stabbing in Chikatilo's case, drugging and strangulation in Dahmer's would mutilate their bodies post-mortem, and sometimes consume parts from them. 2 of their victims were related in some way. Chikatilo killed a mother and her daughter, while Dahmer tried to sexually assault a boy and murdered the boy's brother many years later, and they were both given nicknames for their crimes. They were evaluated prior to their trials, with both being found to have borderline personality disorder and having sadistic features. They unsuccessfully tried to plead insanity, were ultimately found guilty of all but one of the murder charges brought upon them. They both died while incarcerated in 1994. Chikatilo was executed, while Dahmer was murdered, and their crimes would generate long-lasting infamy for decades after their deaths.